This is the Mind the Gap podcast, episode 2. Hello, I'm Dr. Brandon Pardekooper.
And I am Pastor Matt Wozbinski.
And this is Mind the Gap, a podcast designed to help ministry leaders like you fill the gap between your ministry training and your week-to-week experience. Matt, I hope you're doing well. How is it going?
I'm doing very well. I bet that you are doing fantastic.
I am doing amazing. I feel like I'm in a dream still.
Yeah. So for those that don't know, the doctor over here is a big Kansas City Chiefs fan, and they recently won their first Super Bowl in forever.
Yep. 50 years.
Yeah. So that's almost as old as Brandon is. And so it's just been so long. I mean, I'm a Lions fan, so, they have a Super Bowl, so I can't say anything. Right. But it was a really good game.
It hasn't been 50 years for you yet.
No, but they're like the Super Bowl did not exist the last time we won a championship. So that's how long it's been. But it's just one of those things where it was a great game, comeback at the end, which I think they had to do almost every game in the playoffs. So that was really exciting.
They did, yep.
So I was happy for you, kind of living vicariously through you, hoping that one day maybe the Lions can make me that happy, but I doubt it. But congratulations that your boys pulled it off.
Thank you, and my hat's off to the 49ers fans out there. I can imagine the heartbreak you're going through, and I am sorry on some level, just not.
Yeah, they have a ton of Super Bowls. It's sort of like, I mean, I like the Patriots, but like no one feels bad for the Patriots, and I feel like the same thing for the 49ers. Like you've had plenty of parades, you're fine.
Yep, exactly. All right, so today we're going to be talking about how to get your lead pastor to say yes. This is a challenge for a lot of staff pastors. And as a former youth pastor, Matt, how important has this been for you through your career?
So it's incredibly important. I think that the stereotype is that youth pastors are kind of a second-tier pastor. There's the famous quote that youth pastors always joke about. People will always ask you, so when are you going to be a real pastor? Like,
right.
When are you going to be a lead pastor or something along those lines?
Right.
And so, and that's a stereotype that sometimes rings true. I think sometimes it's very common for youth pastors to be sitting in a staff meeting and maybe you have a great idea. A lot of youth pastors are fresh out of Bible college or ministry training or something along those lines. And they're excited. They have all of these fresh ideas. They've been sitting in classrooms and now they finally get to kind of, put their feet to the fire and make it happen. And it's just that constant balance, though, of you're a 22, 23-year-old new person in ministry. Maybe you don't have a ton of experience, but you have a lot of ideas.
Right.
And I think that a lot of times it's nerve-wracking to find that balance of even wanting to submit ideas or suggest ideas because you don't want to get shot down or feel like you're overstepping your bounds or acting like a know-it-all when you're so fresh. But at the same time, you don't want to just be sitting back and letting, well, this is the way that we've always done it, kind of overshadow some really good ideas that could bring some growth and some maturity to your church. So as a youth pastor, it's huge to be able to kind of strategically get your lead pastor to say, yeah, I'm on board with that idea, and how to communicate that because you don't want to swing and miss on some really good ideas just because maybe you didn't present it in the right way. And so that's one of the things that I think it's really helpful to talk about today.
Right. Yeah. Can you think of a time just off the top of your head, and I'm putting you on the spot, of you had a great idea and you pitched it and it just fell on deaf ears, or maybe even got a little kickback on?
Oh, absolutely. So a lot of times what will happen is for the younger generation, I'll say, was technology always seems to be a big pushback. And I think that if we're honest, a lot of reasons for that is a lot of the core people who, if we're honest, are regular givers, are, core foundational people that have been there for a long time. Their families are there, their kids are there, maybe even their grandkids are there, are not a huge fan of technology.
Right.
But you have a lot of younger families or people who are checking out church for the first time, really wanting to, that's how they connect. That's a part of their daily life, whether it's social media or whether it's even just signing up for things online versus, having to go and sign up on a piece of paper. And so that's one thing that I feel like there's been a lot of tension in my career with, is kind of how do you approach pastor and kind of just getting shut down and saying, well, that's just not going to work with the group that we have? And finding that balance between, okay, yes, being respectful of the group that you have, but also building your church in a way to be accepting of the people that you're trying to bring in.
Right.
And so that's definitely one way where it's been like, I've tried and swung and missed and it not gone so well. So
Right. Well, and it's so important because, you know, if you're not the lead pastor, so much of it is dependent on his buy-in, not only to your idea, but into you and into what you're doing in your ministry and your department. And, you know, there's a lot, I've heard, I have lots of stories of staff pastors, regardless of if it's kids or youth or worship or whatever, and their careers in a lot of ways have been determined by the lead pastor that they are with. And so, if you get a lead pastor that's, on board with you, champions your ideas, buys into what you're doing, it can mean a huge difference in your overall career. And so, just getting the yes, getting them, and not only a couple, but a frequent yes, can be challenging, but it's huge if you can get there. And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're just going to give a couple keys to getting that yes from your lead pastor. And so the first key that we want to talk about is building trust. And I think that this goes without saying. You're a pastor, you're on staff, you have your lead pastor, you want him or her to trust you. They've hired you, they've brought you on staff. And so to a certain degree, they trust you. But then there's also that honeymoon period, where you're kind of, you're living off of the trust they just grant you coming in.
Yeah.
And you have to use that well. You have to, you have to negotiate your way through that, because there comes a point where that honeymoon period is gone and that trust is has dissipated. And if you haven't built your own trust with your lead pastor, then you're kind of in a tough spot. And so, again, building trust goes without saying, but at the same time, I've seen a lot of young pastors come in on a staff and they're just moving so fast that they're moving faster than their trust. So, I remember when I was first starting out, there was the analogy of change in your pocket. The idea that you have so much change in your pocket. So when you come on staff, brand new staff member, you start with a full pocket of change. But every time that you maybe make a mistake or do an ask or whatever, you're using, that change. But at the same time, every time you get a win, every time you help in something, every time you go the extra mile, you put more change in your pocket. And so the idea is that you always want to have more change in your pocket than what you're doling out. And so as that kind of that starting full pocket goes, you want to make sure that you're putting change in your pocket in those first few months or first couple of years, so that when that kind of wears out, you've already built a full pocket of change to get those yeses. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing kind of building off of that, that's a really great analogy with the whole change, but creating little wins. So also one of the things that you were talking about is getting that change back. And I think sometimes we always want to hit the home run. We always want to plan a new event that they've never done before. We want sweeping big changes that are going to bring in 100 people. But I think that sometimes what we need to do is be okay with little things. If they ask you to do something, did you do it? If you are asked to maybe tweak something, not fully revamp it, did you do a good job at it?
Right.
And that sort of stuff kind of builds up, like you said, that change where you can then spend it later because you've said, okay, it's a biblical principle, being faithful in the little things. And then out of that, bigger opportunities and bigger things will come along. And so I think that that's really huge. And then the other thing is being wise, kind of going with that change analogy a little bit more, is being wise with how you're spending that change. To pick your battles, to know that there are going to be some things, and I think that this is something that especially young pastors really struggle with, is that there are some things that if you were the lead pastor, you would do differently. And you have to just be okay with the fact that not everything is going to go that way. That not every idea that you have is going to be accepted or even needs to be presented. And save up that change and save up kind of that good collateral that you've built in being faithful in little things and being faithful to things that you've said that you would do. And then when you feel like there's something that, okay, this is something that is going to be a game changer. This is something that, is mission critical, if you will, that I feel like can really change. You want to make a big sweeping change. You want to change the name of a ministry. You want to change the night that you meet on. These big, huge changes. If you've used up all of your change on something kind of like I was joking about, hey, let's change our signups from paper to laptops. That's something that could be good and could be helpful. But if you've used up all your change on things like that, like, hey, I want to paint this wall gray instead of off-white, like if you've used up all your change on that, not saying those things aren't important, but if you've used up all kind of your change and the goodwill that you built up on that, then when you have a big ask, then they're not going to say, well, we already did this and we already changed that and we already, we made all these other like 15 changes in the past 6 months. Let's maybe wait. Let's, pump the brakes a little bit. But if you say, okay, I'm going to save this up and say, hey, we've done this. We've kind of been faithful with that. We've stuck with this process. But I really do believe that this is going to be a great change for the church or the ministry. Then spending that change at the proper time and picking your battles when you're going to use that, I think is also super important.
Right. Yeah. So a little story with that. So I've said for those who don't know, I started out in youth ministry, got my undergrad degree in biblical studies and youth ministry. I had been in youth ministry as a leader for years before, and my first youth pastorate, did not go great. I actually learned that I was awful at being a youth pastor. And part of it was because of exactly what you're talking about. So I had a little youth group of about maybe 15, 20 students. We met in a storefront. So it was a long storefront building. The sanctuary was in the front end. There were a couple offices in the middle, and then this little room in the back. And this is at the time, so this is in 2003. And so this is at a time when that whole industrial look and feel was kind of coming in. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I wanted to do was take out the ceiling tiles of the youth room. Mm-hmm. And, there were, people, older gentlemen in the church that were just not on board with the idea, just did not agree with it at all. And, I was a youth pastor. I was new, and I was, trying to make a statement and trying to create a culture and kind of create a cool space for the students. And, I kind of dug my heels in and said, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to take those tiles out. And they were concerned about they were expenses. What are we going to do with them? I was like, I don't know. I don't really know what we're going to do with them. I just know that I want them out of the youth room. Well, we did it. They, mm-hmm. They kind of succumbed to my persistence and we took them down, and I don't know what we did. My guess is they probably went to somebody's garage because about 6 months later, I was no longer youth pastor at the church, and I was told the next day those tiles were put back into that youth room as probably their own statement about how they felt about me. So build trust and definitely pick your battles well.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Okay. So the second thing that we're going to talk about is think through the ask ahead of time. Think through the ask ahead of time. So for those of you who've read the book Raving by Ken Blanchard and Sheldon Bowles, they talk about the key to getting the yes. So the key to getting your lead pastor to say yes, to buy into what you're wanting to do, is to first have your own vision before you make the ask. A lot of times what we'll do as leaders and as staff pastors, we get so amped up and excited about an idea that we present just the idea. We haven't thought it through. We haven't put any structure to it or any real meat to it. It's just a concept, really.
Yeah.
And we go to our lead pastor and we kind of pitch this concept. Now, a good lead pastor is going to have a lot of questions. Mm-hmm. The problem is if we haven't thought through far enough, then we aren't going to be able to answer those questions. And in Raving Fans, it even talks about that. It talks about this idea that if you have thought it through and you've prepared yourself before you've made the ask, then you already understand your vision, and hopefully you understand your pastor's vision. Mm-hmm. And so by thinking it through, you're able to kind of draw the line between what you're wanting to do and what your lead pastor is wanting to do. So that way, the work is not on your lead pastor to draw that line. You do it for them. And so kind of creating that seamless picture of, hey, lead pastor, I want to do this, and here are the reasons why. And this is how it fits into our overall vision, or your overall vision as the lead pastor. Kind of creates a little more common ground, and hopefully kind of plows that ground for the lead pastor to say yes. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that being prepared is super important, because I think that sometimes, kind of going back to the whole, especially young pastors, I think that a lot of times we can get caught up in the momentum. We see that Elevation or Hillsong, or, you know, a church that maybe a ministry that we did before worked so well.
Right.
And we want to kind of jump on that, and we want to get it rolling and get the ball moving. And a lot of times we don't think about the questions. Well, okay, how are we going to staff this with volunteers? What's the cost going to be? Do we have the facility to pull this off? And then once again, is this something that is in alignment with where we're going as a church, and what the pastors kind of said, this is as the vision where we're going as a church. And I think that knowing your audience, which is your lead, is super important, because not, you know, I don't mean this in a bad way, but the lead pastor isn't really caring too much about your student ministry outside of how it's affecting the overall church.
Right.
And so, you know, you can have very great things, but a lead pastor has a lot on their plate. And so if you're just like, hey, it'll be fun, like that's great, that's cool, but
Right.
at the same time, like, how is that pouring back into, hey, you know, in the past few staff meetings, you've really been saying how you want to build a culture of invitation. And I really feel like doing this event will inspire both our students and their parents to kind of create that environment where they can feel like they can invite people. Because what that's doing is that's setting off little alarms in your lead pastor, saying, that's what I'm passionate about. That's what I'm focused on. That's where I feel like God is leading us as a church. And so if you can be kind of going alongside, kind of in your sidecar, your vision, going along with where they are going, I think that's super helpful. Another thing about just being prepared is it kind of also tests you a little bit, and, you know, helps you see, is this something that's actually going to work, or is this kind of like a flash in the pan, something that's very, you know, here today, gone tomorrow? Because especially in youth ministry, culture changes so fast. And I think that sometimes we, you know, whether it's a really cool sermon series or something that we saw another church do, I think sometimes we can say, oh, we got to get on this really quick. But then maybe it doesn't connect with the culture of your church, or maybe there are some logistical things that you haven't really thought through. You just kind of saw that it was successful, and you want your ministry to be successful as well. And so you want to jump on it. But I think that kind of thinking through, okay, the questions that you're going to be asked, then it kind of will almost make you more confident even going into that ask, because, you know, no, I've thought this through. This isn't just something that, you know, I'm just pulling out of my ears. Like, it's something that I have thought about. And then I think that also helps your lead pastor say, okay, this isn't something that is just kind of an offhand remark, hey, maybe we should try this out, but it's something that you've processed, and it shows me that, you know, you have enough care to have looked into, how do we execute it? How much is it going to cost? How will this affect our ministries that we currently have? You know, you have all those questions kind of laid out. And so it's not like I don't know, let me get back to you. Well, maybe I was thinking this. And it just kind of gives you a little bit more stability, especially coming in with someone who hasn't maybe proved themselves that you can pull that off. I think that it's very helpful for a lead pastor to know that, yes, I've thought this through, and I think that we can execute it.
Right. Well, and I want to draw attention to something that you're saying, but you're not saying it specifically. But one of the biggest things your pastor is going to be concerned about, obviously, is vision. We've talked about that, but it's resources is the other thing. And you've touched on it, because, you know, I would think as a lead pastor, the two main resources they're going to be concerned about is the time of volunteers and obviously the cost, the budget. And if you can think through those things, and if you can answer the questions and show why what you're spending is worth it, and why the volunteer time is going to be worth it, that's going to position you in a lot better place for your lead pastor to say yes. Because a good lead pastor is going to guard volunteer time, because it's a commodity or it's a resource that as a church you can't be flippant with. You have to be aware, especially in this society now where people are busy. And so if they're going to volunteer their time, it needs to be to an event or a ministry or something that has high impact, and not just, hey, it'd be fun to do, or hey, it'll be cool. It's got to have some sort of lasting impact. And then again, on the finance side, most churches have limited finances. And so,
Mhm.
the lead pastor is going to be aware, especially over budgets he's not directly overseeing, going to be aware of, okay, how much is this going to cost to make sure that it's actually worth it, especially big events. Big events are high dollar events and usually don't have a lot of impact. And so,
Mhm.
finding a way to clarify this is going to have a larger impact on the vision, on the church as a whole, and on my ministry or department. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
all good things to think about.
Yeah, and I think that kind of a personal example is there's a lot of that give and take and being aware of that give and take. So, for example, I was in ministry and the budget currently was set up that we had 2 big events a year. We had like some sort of back to school bash where, I'm making these numbers up, but we spent $1,000 on the back to school bash.
Right.
And we spent $1,000 on a end of the school year sort of thing. So it was sort of like beginning of school, end of school, that sort of thing.
Right.
And what we realized is that numerically we would have large numbers, but we'd have very little retention. So you have a lot of guests because you were giving away an Xbox and you were doing all this sort of stuff. Very big event like thing. And I actually went to summer camp and met with some other pastors, and they said we actually switched our model, and one midweek a month we would do a smaller one where instead of spending $1,000 once a year, we would spend $100 every month and do smaller things. But then you had that consistency. And then what I had to do was, one, you're pointing out the financial. It's the same amount of money. Instead of just one big chunk, we're doing smaller chunks spread out. And then 2, when it comes to the impact of it, we want our students to be relational. We want it to be this consistent thing. And we would rather have 3 or 4 guests and then retain 2 of them every time than have 60 guests and retain 10 of them once. And so if you can kind of show kind of that vision of it's the same amount of financial resources, the time is actually less because we're already meeting on a weekly basis. And if you can have those questions kind of sorted out and you're asking those questions and answering those questions before they're even asked, it shows that you've put thought into what's on their mind and the pressure that's on their shoulders and the responsibility they have. And it's more likely that they're going to surrender that over to you and say, yes, okay, you've thought this through. This isn't going to be another thing on my plate, but this actually might be a relief off of me. Let's go forward and try it.
Right. So good. So good. Okay, so just to recap so far, we've talked about building trust. We've talked about thinking through the ask ahead of time. And then the third thing is communicate with clear and sufficient information. Communicate with clear and sufficient information. In the book, Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make, Hans Finzel, that's a fun name, Hans.
Oh, yes. Sounds like a villain.
Yeah. He talks about communication chaos, and he talks about how most problems in churches and in ministries, it stems from a lack of clear communication. And for any of us who've been on staff at any level, at any amount of time, know that communication on staff can very quickly get all chaotic. And so, the biggest thing in what we're talking here is never assume that your lead pastor knows anything. Now, I say that kind of tongue in cheek because it doesn't mean that your lead pastor is out of touch. It doesn't mean that your lead pastor is clueless about what's happening. But at the same time, if you have a good lead pastor who's not micromanaging you, who isn't in the middle of everything you're doing, kind of like what you alluded to, they have no idea really what's going on in your ministry. They see snapshots here and there. If you're on a worship, if you're a worship pastor, they're seeing you on stage for that 20-minute, half-hour window. But beyond that, they don't know what's happening internally in the culture of your ministry. And so, when you go with the idea or you go with the ask, you want to make sure that you are communicating all the necessary information that they need to know. It may
Mhm.
be backstory, it may be details. A lot of times you got to find the balance between too many details and enough details, but you want to paint the picture for them so that they can make an informed decision. Because one thing a lead pastor hates is to be in the dark and to make a decision with very limited information and have that decision come back to bite them because they didn't have the right information.
Mhm.
And that's on us as staff pastors. That's on us to make sure they have the right information to make a clear decision to give us the go ahead or not. And so, so when making the request, making sure that you're casting that vision, sharing the idea, giving the necessary information, and clarifying the communication so that they have enough information to make a decision on.
Yeah. So 2 quick points on that. One, I think that keeping your lead in the loop is super important because if you have a good lead, then that lead will then have your back if they know that it's not going to bite them.
Yes.
So like you said, you don't need to overshare. They don't need to know every specific detail. But what typically happens is not everyone's going to like the decision. Not everyone's going to like the direction that you're going. And so what will happen is if they have no idea this is going on. So let's go back to the whole, let's not do too big events, but let's do small events throughout the year.
Mm-hmm.
And they get something that says, they get a call from a parent that says, hey, so we're not outreaching anymore. Like we're just, they canceled the end of the year party and they're just not doing it anymore. And my kid's so upset. Why aren't we going to that summer camp anymore? Why aren't we doing this event anymore? And if that's the first they're hearing about it,
right,
then all of a sudden they say, well, that doesn't make sense. That's been successful. We've had 20 guests every time that we've done it.
right.
But if they don't know the details of, well, yes, we'll have 20 people show up because we're giving away an Xbox, but we'll only have 1 or 2 of those people stay behind, come back the next week,
right,
then they don't have that information. So the more that you can communicate, we've seen a successful trend of this happening, or in other ministries have seen this, or research has shown, or whatever that might be. The more that you can communicate to them, then when that parent or when that student or when that board member comes along and says, hey, why aren't we doing this anymore? Why did this change? Then they at least have a base level knowledge that they can say, well, what we're trying is because we've realized that this isn't as successful as maybe we thought it was, or it's not as effective, or it's not the best use of our time, money, resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is super important. And then also the other thing too is just, once again, having that vision from the get-go and making sure that you know all of that information, because the disappointment often comes in when you're casting that vision in a very vague way. They might have something in their mind that isn't even really what you're trying to accomplish.
Yep.
You can say, hey, we're going to have a worship night where we're going to invite the students and we're going to invite maybe the community, and we're going to have a worship night. And they're thinking this is going to be, Hillsong. We're going to have the building packed and people are going to be jumping, and we're going to have, we're going to order in lights and all this sort of stuff. And then they show up and it's a small acoustic intimate thing. And that maybe was what you were intending the entire time, but they're thinking, oh, well, if this was it, I was not that I wouldn't have done it, but there might even be some level of disappointment. Or they're expecting the small acoustic, hey, this is going to be an hour-long prayer session. And then you come in and, all right, everybody, who's ready to rock? And they're like, what happened to my auditorium?
Right.
And so the more that you can have that clear vision, the less likely there's going to be that disappointment, even if it's a success. That gap between, once again, minding that gap between what's expected and what the reality is. And the more that you can know the concrete of what you're trying to accomplish and what the end goal of what you're trying to accomplish is, I think that will help your leader when it's 2 weeks after and you say, okay, was this successful? We were trying to help create a culture of invitation. How many people did we invite? Or was this just all church people? Or we're trying to create a community where people feel like they can belong. How many people of our regular attenders came to this? Or how many of it was just new people? And so the more that you can communicate what the goal is and what the vision is, then it makes it even better and kind of covers your butt a little bit
Yep.
Because then you're both on the same page of what you were trying to accomplish. Hey, I know we didn't go super deep today, and we kind of, we went one each deep, but we went super wide and we had a bunch of new people. Or, hey, we went super deep and I know we only had, 8 kids sign up for the retreat, but all 8 of those kids, were praying and fasting and they were bought in. And so the more that you can kind of communicate what the goal of what you're trying to do, then the less likely there's going to be that disappointment when you guys are looking at 2 different goals.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Well, and I think a lot of that too, kind of what you're saying is managing the expectations of your lead pastor, making sure that you're communicating what they need to know. And part of that even comes in the more planned out and the more you see the months and the weeks ahead, you can even be strategic about laying the groundwork for that. Maybe there's a statistic or a stat or some data from your ministry that you can share weeks in advance that your lead pastor is already kind of processing through or thinking about, or maybe, there's some development going on or some trend that you can kind of share weeks in advance. So you're not bombarding them with everything in the moment. You kind of lay it out over weeks and months so that when you come in for the ask, you've already laid that information out. You've already provided it for them. The lead pastor's already been thinking about it or even bothered by it. But, if you share something, a trend that's happening, that may be bothering them. So when you come in with a solution or with an idea to fix the problem, they're ready to go because they've already been bothered by what you've shared beforehand. And so the more planned out you can be, the more strategic you can be about that information share, and the more you can manage those expectations ahead of time before you make the ask. And so, it's not only setting yourself up well to get the yes, but it's also setting your lead pastor up well to be able to say yes. Because there's risk. Every time your lead pastor, stamps your idea and says, yeah, go ahead and do it, they recognize they're putting a certain degree of risk. Our job as staff pastors is to minimize the risk of the lead pastor to make sure that when they say yes, it's either very low risk or no risk at all. Because they trust us, they believe in what we're doing, and we've already done the groundwork to prepare them for what's about to come.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think kind of one of my last little thoughts about this is that I don't know if other people are like me, but I tend to be a people pleaser.
No, and none of those around.
Exactly. You don't find a lot of people in ministry who like people.
No.
And so once I've kind of, dug my teeth into a vision or I have an idea and I really want to execute it, sometimes the temptation can be, a yes at any cost.
Yeah.
And I think that the less prepared you are to present that in a proper way and in a thought out way, you might find yourself overcommitting to something that you're not ready for, or biting off more than you can chew. And so I found myself in that where, in my brain, I think I'm agreeing to this and I'll figure it out later how I'm actually going to pull it off. Oh yeah, it won't be that expensive. Yeah, we can definitely stay under that budget. Or, oh yeah, we can definitely get enough volunteers for that. Not really knowing if I can do that, but you just are like wanting this to happen.
Yeah.
So then when those questions arise, you kind of just are trying to, you're close to the yes. And so you're just trying to kind of sweeten it a little bit.
Right.
Versus I've done my research. So then I feel like there's a lot of pastors that would honestly rather say, no, we can't fit it in that budget. We can fit it in this budget. I know that for sure. We can stay under this, but we can't stay under this.
Right.
Versus, oh yeah, we can definitely stay under this. And then 2 months after they look at it and they're like, oh, you went $300 over the budget. What happened? So I think that the more that you're prepared, the less likely it is that you're going to just sort of sacrifice maybe some of your time, your sanity, and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
Trying to pull it off because you're like, hey, I said that I would do this. And so I just need to figure out a way to make it happen because you actually know what it's going to take volunteer wise, financially, emotionally, all this sort of stuff.
Right. Well, and I'll close out this, this point by saying one rule of ministry that I've had from the very beginning, I was taught by my mentors and I've carried it through, is under promise and over deliver. Because too many, especially young pastors, will over promise and under deliver. And kind of going back to the change in your pocket, you're always giving out more change than you're taking in. But if you under promise and over deliver, you're managing the expectations so that when you hit that under promise, maybe something didn't go right and maybe you didn't do everything you wanted to do, but because you under promised, your lead pastor may have no idea that you didn't hit your marks because you only manage their expectation to a certain point and everything else is going to be extra. Whereas when you under promise and then you actually over deliver, your lead pastor is like, whoa, I'm so impressed with what you've done because this is what I was expecting. And you were able to do so much more. And so not only is that setting up the event well and managing things well and all of that, but it's also kind of you're building in a win inside of a win. You're not only executing what you promised that you would, but you're kind of adding to it, which then just deepens your lead pastor's trust in you, deepens, even your ministry people's trust in you, because they know that when you say what you're going to do is happening, they also learn over time, we might get more, but they're ready for that little bit and the extra. And so under promise, over deliver, and you'll constantly have change in your pocket. So, all right, Matt, any final thoughts on this?
No, I just want to really communicate that, you're not always going to get this right. And that's for all these topics, kind of as we start this podcast. There are so many times I look back at past Matt and say, man, that probably wasn't the best way to pull that off. But what I will say is take some of these things to heart and just really think through, if you were in your lead pastor's position, there's so much that kind of is on their mind that they have to process. And you're trying to go in there saying, this is something that can be a win for not only my ministry, but the church overall. And it's also something that I'm taking off of your plate. I'm not adding more things for you to do.
Right.
So the more that you can kind of process through from that perspective, then the more likely it is that they're going to come alongside you and give you the resources and the support that you need to execute the vision that God has given you. So don't kind of just get this tunnel vision of, well, I'm the worship pastor, so I need to this will be good for the worship team. Or I'm the youth pastor, so this will be good for the youth group or the children's ministry. But how will this be good for the church? How will this be good for, it's helpful to have good teenagers, because then teenagers are bringing their parents and, or kids. This is going to be great for the kids, but if we have a really great kids program, then people will feel comfortable bringing their families to this church. So be thinking about the bigger vision of the church, not just specifically yours, when you're going to address a lead pastor about your specific vision for your ministry.
Right. That's good. Yeah. More of a holistic mentality.
Good.
Well, and I would add to kind of close this out, you're not always going to get the yes. And so when you don't get the yes, obviously go back and evaluate the ask. Did you set it up? Did you manage expectations? Did you communicate clearly? Did you do all the things that we're talking about today? And there are times when you can do all of those things and still get a no. And as an executive pastor, I've kind of been on the other side a little bit, where I've seen no's handed out with very little explanation. And as a staff pastor, it's easy to kind of walk away from there and be like, hey, I did everything right. Why didn't I get the yes? What did I do wrong? And if you're not careful, you can actually get angry at your lead pastor. Like, why didn't I get the yes? Like, I did everything right. You're just not buying into what I'm doing. You don't believe in my ministry. You don't believe in me. Youth ministry or worship ministry or kids ministry just isn't important to you. There's a lot of rabbit trails you can go down if you let yourself. And I think to a certain extent, as a staff pastor, you have to be okay with not knowing why you're getting the no.
Yeah.
Because sometimes there's a no handed out because of information you have no idea what it is and your lead pastor can't share. And so, sometimes, again, the first thing is make sure you did all the things right. Make sure you presented everything well. Make sure you check all your boxes. And if you've done all of that and you still get a no with little to no explanation, don't dwell on it. Move on to the next thing. Move on to the next idea. Maybe recycle it and come back to it down the road. But don't always expect an explanation, because you might not get it.
Yeah.
And you just need to be okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good.
If you know a ministry leader looking to grow and take their ministry to the next level, please share this podcast with them. Go deeper by joining us on Facebook under I Will Mind the Gap, where you can ask questions that we can answer in future episodes. Remember to subscribe to the podcast, rate it, and share it. Until next time, remember to mind the gap of your ministry.